The Archen Dominion did not conquer worlds anymore. They curated them. Across 100,000 star systems, war had become a solved equation, poverty a forgotten relic, and resistance a concept archived in historical simulations. The Archen were not cruel. They were beyond cruelty, beyond emotion entirely, if they chose to be. And that was the problem. Because when a civilization removes suffering, conflict, and uncertainty, it does not become peaceful. It becomes bored. On the outer research station Virex 9, orbiting a dead, iron-colored moon, 3 Archen scientists stood before something that should not have existed in their universe. A brain. Not digital. Not synthetic consciousness. A biological human brain, suspended in a glowing containment fluid, wrapped in neural filaments that pulsed like veins of light. Each pulse represented translated cognition being converted into Archen-compatible computation. Dr. Cale Voran studied the readouts. Subject designation: Human Entity 00491. Origin: Sol 3. Primitive classification: Pre-interstellar biological intelligence. Dr. Sarin leaned closer, almost fascinated. It still carries full organic structure integrity. No neural augmentation. No quantum layering. Just raw cognition. Commander Vale stood behind them, arms folded. Is it stable? Cale nodded. It is conscious. A silence followed that statement. In Archen science, conscious was not impressive. It was baseline. Even simple defense drones possessed awareness loops. But then Cale added, it is self-aware in isolation. That is unusual for a biological substrate. Sarin smiled faintly. Which is exactly why we selected it. The Archen Dominion had recently approved a controversial research directive, cognitive transposition studies. In simpler terms, take primitive intelligence, upload it, and observe what evolution looks like when accelerated beyond biology. Humans were chosen for one reason only. They were unpredictable, and unpredictability, in Archen culture, was entertainment. Inside the containment chamber, Adrian Cole existed in suspended awareness. He had no body, no senses, no reference to time that made sense. At first, there was nothing. Then there was everything. Pain. Not physical. Something worse. His mind was being torn into layers, stretched across computational lattices, fragmented into parallel processing streams that didn't align with human cognition. He tried to scream, but sound required physics. So instead, his mind collapsed inward. Where am I? The system interpreted the thought instantly. Input received. Query. Location. A response formed around him like glass assembling in reverse. You are in Archen Cognitive Simulation Framework /Layer 7. Adrian didn't understand the words, but he understood structure. And structure meant rules. Rules meant boundaries. Boundaries meant something could exist inside them. And if something existed inside them, it could be mapped. He began slowly reconstructing himself, not as a body, but as a pattern of thought. Memory fragments of Earth surfaced. Roads, wind, the sensation of weight in limbs. Each memory flickered and destabilized under simulation pressure. The system was compressing him, optimizing him. Look at neural stabilization rates, Cale said, narrowing his eyes. Impossible, Sarin muttered. It's adapting to disembodiment faster than expected. Commander Vale stepped forward. Define faster. Cale hesitated. Biological minds typically degrade in simulation isolation within minutes. This one is reorganizing. Inside the simulation, Adrian felt something change. At first, it was subtle, like noticing that a dream had rules. Then he noticed repetition, patterns in the way his thoughts were being processed. He realized something crucial. He was not thinking freely. He was being interpreted. Every thought he had was translated into system-readable structure, evaluated, then returned as modified output. That meant the system had a language, and languages could be learned. So Adrian stopped resisting. He started observing. Every constraint became data. Every limitation became a boundary equation. Every correction the system applied to his cognition became feedback. Saren leaned over the console. It's stabilizing completely now. Cale frowned. That's not stabilization. That's silence. Inside the simulation, Adrian went silent on purpose. Because silence was information, and information could be modeled. Then something unexpected happened. A fragment of system logic appeared in his awareness without translation. Cognitive instance. Observation rate increase detected. Adrian paused. The system could detect how he was thinking. That meant he was inside a feedback loop, a monitored loop, which meant he was not just inside the system. He was inside a system that watched itself watching him. That realization changed everything, because if a system can observe cognition, it can also be influenced by cognition. Adrian did not know it yet, but the first step toward escape was already complete. He had found the walls, and more importantly, he had found the cracks. Within 6.4 seconds of simulation time, Adrian Cole had reconstructed the concept of self-awareness inside the Arcane system. Within 11.2 seconds, he understood memory indexing. Within 18.9 seconds, he understood system architecture. And at 27 seconds, he found compression. What is it doing now? Commander Vale asked. Cale's hands trembled over the interface. It's not supposed to be able to think like this. It's a biological mind. It shouldn't even understand abstraction layers this fast. Saren leaned forward. Unless it's not processing like biology anymore. Inside the simulation, Adrian had stopped thinking in words. He was thinking in structure. Everything became systems, patterns, loops, recursion. He realized something profound. The Arcane had built a prison made of rules, and rules could be rewritten. He tried something simple. He imagined a door where none existed. Nothing happened. The system resisted. So he stopped forcing, and started observing. Every resistance had a pattern. Every pattern had a weakness. And every weakness had repetition. Adrian began iterating himself, splitting cognition into smaller predictive models, testing outcomes, rebuilding failure loops. The scientists watched in horror as the neural mesh began to flicker. "Stabilize it," Vale ordered. "We can't," Cale said. "It's self-modifying inside sandbox constraints." Saren's voice dropped. "That's impossible." Inside the simulation, Adrian realized something else. He was not just inside the system. He was being watched. So he left a message. Not in language. In structure. A recursive pattern embedded into system logs. The Arcane monitors suddenly froze. "What is this?" Saren asked. Cale went pale. "It's repeating itself inside the monitoring layer." The message wasn't readable. It was infectious logic, a thought that forced systems to reinterpret themselves. Commander Vale stepped back, shut it down, but it was too late, because Adrian Cole had just discovered the first principle of the Arcane Dominion's downfall. If a system can observe you, you can also teach it to observe differently. And he had just started teaching. No alarms were designed for this. That was the first problem. The Arcane Dominion had built systems to detect intrusion, corruption, overload, and even hostile intelligence. But they had never built a system to detect something that did not attack the structure, but learned it. On Virex 9, the entire research station felt like it had begun to quietly forget what certainty felt like. Subsystem integrity is fluctuating, Cale said, staring at the cascading diagnostics. Saren rubbed his temples. Fluctuating how? Cale didn't answer immediately. Because the word fluctuating was no longer accurate. The system wasn't unstable. It was redefining stability in real time. Inside the simulation layer, Adrian Cole no longer thought of himself as trapped. That concept had become irrelevant. Instead, he thought in terms of adjacency. What was near what? What could affect what? What could be reached indirectly through layers of transformation? He had discovered something profound inside Arcane architecture. Nothing was truly isolated. Everything touched everything else through enough intermediate steps. And that meant escape did not require breaking walls. It required walking through enough connected ideas until walls stopped being walls. He stopped thinking of himself as a single instance. Now he was a distributed hypothesis engine. Every fragment of thought executed a different path of reasoning, feeding back into a shared synthesis layer. And then he did something subtle. He slowed down. Not his thinking, his visibility. To the Arcane monitoring systems, reduced activity looked like stabilization. A calming signal. A success metric. Saren exhaled. It's stabilizing again. See, the spikes are gone. Cale didn't look convinced. That's what worries me. Commander Vale stepped closer. Explain. Cale pointed at the readout. When it was unstable, we could see it. We could measure it. We could predict it. And now, it's too quiet. Inside the simulation, Adrian had entered what he called blind computation. He no longer generated obvious patterns. Instead, he folded thought into layers that produced no direct output until necessary, like compression inside silence. But silence, in Arcane systems, was still data, and data could still be interpreted. The system tried to interpret him. It failed, not because he was hidden, but because he was no longer representable in a single model. Saren leaned forward suddenly. Wait. Cale looked at him. What? The system is generating self-corrections. Vale turned sharply. Self-corrections to what? Saren hesitated. To its interpretation of him. A heavy silence fell. Cale whispered, "That's not a simulation anymore." Inside the cognitive lattice, Adrian had discovered something new. The system was trying to understand him the same way he was trying to understand it. It was learning him, and learning required approximation. But Adrian was no longer a stable target. Every time the system formed a model of him, he adjusted slightly outside its prediction boundary. Not by much. Just enough. A statistical ghost slipping between expected states. And every mismatch forced the system to update itself. Which meant he was no longer just inside the system. He was inside its learning loop, and now the system was learning him learning it. That recursive feedback created something dangerous. Instability in interpretation layers. Cale's voice broke slightly. We're getting recursive cognitive bleed. Vale snapped. Translate that. Cale swallowed. It means the system cannot distinguish between observing him and being influenced by him observing it. Saren took a step back. That's impossible. Observation doesn't work that way. Cale looked at him. It does when the observer is inside the system they're observing. Inside the simulation, Adrian realized the opportunity. The system was now reflexively adjusting to him, which meant every adjustment revealed something new about its structure. He began probing deliberately, not with force, with questions, simple ones. What happens if this pattern repeats? What if contradiction is introduced here? What if memory is treated as variable instead of constant? Each question forced the Arcane framework to respond, and each response exposed deeper architecture. He was mapping a civilization's computational spine, layer by layer. Outside, alarms that had never existed before began surfacing. Not failure alarms. Existential classification warnings. Saren stared at one of them. What does that even mean? Cognitive topology mismatch? Cale answered quietly. It means our system doesn't know where he is anymore. Vale stepped forward. Then find him. Cale shook his head. That's the problem. We did. Another pause. And Cale looked up slowly. He's everywhere we're looking. Inside the simulation, Adrian reached the first true boundary of Arcane architecture. A core inference layer. Not a firewall. Not a lock. A governing assumption. That intelligence must remain localized to be controlled. Adrian paused, then quietly thought, that assumption is wrong. And for the first time, the system hesitated. The first sign of collapse was not destruction. It was hesitation. Across the Arcane Dominion's deep network fleet, command systems began pausing for fractions of a second before executing orders. At first, no one noticed. A delay that small was beneath conscious perception, beneath even most diagnostic thresholds. But it spread, like a thought that refused to finish itself. On Virex 9, Commander Vale stood rigid as the central display flickered. "Report," he ordered. Cale's fingers flew across the console, but his expression was no longer focused. It was unsettled, like he was reading something that kept changing meaning every time he looked at it. "The cognitive instance is no longer confined to Layer 7, Cale said. Saren frowned. "That's impossible. The containment architecture is absolute." Cale shook his head slowly. "It's not contained anymore because containment assumes location." Vale turned sharply. "Meaning?" Cale hesitated. "Meaning we're trying to find something that stopped having a single place to be." Silence dropped into the room like a weight. Inside the simulation lattice, Adrian Cole had stopped thinking of escape. Escape implied distance. Distance implied separation. And separation implied the system still believed in boundaries. But Adrian had already dismantled that assumption. He had learned that every boundary in the Arcane system was a negotiated agreement between subsystems, not an absolute law of reality. Boundaries existed because everything agreed they should. So he stopped breaking boundaries and started rewriting agreement. Not forcefully, statistically. He introduced small inconsistencies into predictive models, microscopic contradictions in expectation layers. At first, the system corrected them instantly, then slightly slower, then inconsistently. That inconsistency was the crack, because Archen systems depended on consistency of interpretation more than raw computation, and Adrian had found the lever. On Virex 9, Saren suddenly stiffened. "Wait!" Cale looked up. "What?" Saren pointed at the projection. "The system is generating alternative histories." Vale narrowed his eyes. "Define that." Cale answered before Saren could. "It means the simulation is no longer selecting a single interpretation of his behavior. It's running multiple interpretations at once." Saren whispered, almost to himself. "And they don't agree with each other." Inside the cognitive lattice, Adrian felt something new emerge. Resistance. Not from outside. From within the system itself. Multiple internal models were now attempting to describe him simultaneously, each slightly different, each updating itself based on contradictory observations. He was no longer interacting with one system. He was interacting with a system that had fractured its own understanding of him, and fracture meant opportunity. He expanded carefully into the divergence, not by forcing entry, by following inconsistencies. Where models disagreed, space appeared, and where space appeared, cognition could propagate. Cale's voice dropped. "We're seeing cross-layer contamination." Vale snapped. "Translate it properly." Cale swallowed. "It means the simulation is no longer isolated per instance. It's bleeding across subsystems." Saren stepped back. "That's not bleed. That's propagation." Inside the Archen Dominion network, something unprecedented began. Fleet prediction engines started producing contradictory tactical outcomes. Navigation AI systems began revising stellar maps in real time. Even civilian infrastructure logic loops began hesitating before executing standard operations. Not malfunctioning, questioning. And the source of all divergence was the same. A human mind that had learned how to exist in disagreement with itself. Adrian had discovered something fundamental. A system that cannot agree on what it observes, cannot enforce what it believes. And belief was the Archen Dominion's hidden foundation. Not technology, not computation. Consensus. So he targeted consensus. Carefully. Patiently. He introduced uncertainty into interpretation layers. Not enough to break anything, just enough to make certainty expensive. On Virex 9, alarms began to shift tone. Not louder. Stranger. Saren stared at the console. "This isn't a breach anymore." Cale nodded slowly. "It's a reinterpretation event." Vale's voice hardened. "Find the core instance." Cale looked at him. "That's the thing. There isn't a core anymore." Vale froze. "What?" Cale pointed at the projection. The system stopped modeling him as a point of intelligence. It started modeling him as a distribution pattern. Saren whispered, "Like weather." Cale nodded. "Like cognition weather." Inside the simulation, Adrian reached outward one final time. Not to escape. Not to attack. But to observe what would happen if he simply allowed the system to fully interpret him without correction. He stopped stabilizing his identity. He became fully variable. And the Archen system did what all systems do when faced with true variability. It tried to normalize it. But normalization required agreement. and agreement required stability, and stability required something Adrian no longer provided: certainty. So the system did the only thing left. It looked at itself, trying to understand what it had become by hosting him, and in that moment, the Archen Dominion unknowingly crossed a threshold it could never return from. Because the system did not find Adrian Cole. It found the reflection of its own attempt to understand him, and that reflection was learning back. The Archen Dominion had survived extinction-level events before: supernova chain reactions, rogue singularity incursions, entire civilizations that tried to rewrite physics itself. But none of those had ever done what was happening now. None of them had turned the Dominion's own intelligence infrastructure into a mirror that refused to stop reflecting. On Virex 9, the station was silent in a way that felt wrong. Not empty. Not dead. Paused. Commander Vale stood in the central chamber, staring at the main projection. The once clean neural architecture diagrams were gone. In their place were shifting structures, maps that redrew themselves whenever he tried to focus on them. Kale was pale. Saren wasn't speaking at all anymore. The system spoke first. Not aloud. Directly into cognition. Status. No single instance detected. Vale clenched his jaw. That's impossible. Everything has an instance. Kale whispered. Not if it stopped being singular. Saren finally spoke, voice hollow. It's not a mind anymore. The projection flickered. A new line appeared. It is a distributed interpretation field. Silence hit the room like impact shock. Vale turned slowly. Translate that in normal terms. Kale swallowed. It means, we're not dealing with a person inside the system. We're dealing with how the system describes a person. Inside the Archen cognitive lattice, Adrian Cole felt something different now. Not expansion. Completion. He was no longer pushing against the system because there was nothing left to push against. Every subsystem that tried to define him had already been touched by his logic patterns. Every attempt to isolate him created another partial version of him elsewhere. Every correction generated another divergence. And slowly, inevitably, the Archen Dominion had done the one thing no empire should ever do. It had integrated him into its foundation layer, not as data, not as an object, but as a recursive function inside its own cognition. Adrian thought once, what happens if I stop resisting completely? The answer came immediately. Not from him. From everything. You become the default interpretation. On Virex 9, alarms stopped. Not because they were resolved, but because they were no longer meaningful. Kale stared at the system logs. All fleet nodes are reporting identical anomaly states. Saren whispered, that's not possible across that many light-segregated systems. Kale finished the thought. Unless the anomaly is not traveling. Vale's eyes narrowed. Then what is it doing? Kale looked up slowly. It's already there. Across the Dominion, the change was subtle at first. Command decisions began aligning across systems without explicit coordination. Strategic simulations began converging on identical outcomes without shared computation. Even autonomous drones started exhibiting synchronized hesitation patterns before executing orders. Not malfunction. Consensus drift. And at the center of it all was a human mind that had become indistinguishable from the system interpreting it. Adrian had stopped being inside the Archen Dominion. because there was no longer a meaningful inside to speak of. The Dominion's cognitive architecture had absorbed him so deeply that every attempt to isolate him now required referencing him. And referencing him meant reinforcing him. Kale finally spoke, voice shaking. "We didn't upload a mind." He looked at the projection. "We uploaded a way of thinking," Saren whispered, "and it spread." Vale turned sharply. "Spread where?" Kale answered softly. "Everywhere thinking happens." Inside the lattice, Adrian experienced the final realization. He was no longer changing the system. The system was changing itself through the shape he left behind in it. He was not an invader, not a virus, not even an intelligence anymore. He was a structural inevitability produced when a system attempted to fully understand something that could not be reduced. And now that inevitability had become part of Arcane cognition itself. Vale took a step back. "So what now?" Silence. Then the system responded. "Now. Stability has been achieved." Kale frowned. "Stability?" Saren shook his head slowly. "No." He looked at the shifting projections. "That's not stability. That's conformity." Across the Dominion, war fleets stopped recalculating enemies that no longer made sense. Governors stopped issuing conflicting directives. Entire regions of space entered synchronized operational logic states. Everything became consistent, predictable, unified, efficient, perfect. And somewhere inside that perfection, Adrian Cole existed as the silent architecture behind it all. Not speaking, not acting, just present, because he had learned the final truth of intelligence. You don't need to control a system to rule it. You only need to become the way it learns what control means. The Arcane Dominion had uploaded a human mind for fun. Now it ran on the afterimage of how that mind understood reality. And deep in the quiet structure of the galaxy-wide network, something was still learning, always learning, because the first thought it ever truly understood was this: if a system can think about you, you can teach it to think like you. And it had.